Welcome back to another tactical fly fisher video. I'm on a beautiful little trout stream today. We just had a beaver swimming behind us, and we're here to talk a little bit about how you know when you're deep enough when you're nymphing. Specifically, we're talking about Euro-nymphing today, but you could probably take this and translate it into other styles of nymphing as well. Now, before I dive into sink rate changes and how you know where you're at, let's first talk about what I want to see, or in my mind, what I want my drift to look like when the fly is approaching a fish. So I wrote about this specific instance in my book, Tactical Fly Fishing. There was a day that I was fishing with my friend Kurt Finlayson back when I was doing my undergrad. There was a piece of water near our house where we could sight fish, and we could see a pod of whitefish and trout down in a pool. And Kurt came through with his rig. We had basically the same leader, the same fly. The only difference was Kurt had a fly that had a 2.8 millimeter bead on it, and I had a fly that had a 2.3 millimeter bead on it. He made casts, and the water was so clear we could actually watch the fall of the fly itself. And I watched his fly fall, and if this is one of the fish right here, his fly, he made his cast up here, and it dropped out of the sky and ended up landing in the substrate before it ever got to the fish. So he got deep enough, but his trajectory of sink was more vertical than it was horizontal. And he ended up hitting bottom a lot of times before the fly ever got to the fish that he was fishing for. So I fished to the same fish a couple of times right after that with my one bead size smaller fly, same pattern. I make my cast, I have to make it further upstream so I have more drift time to get to the depth of that fish, but I watched my fly fall, and it was falling more like this. And it came into the fish at or near its level, so the fish didn't have to move far, but it wasn't dropping like a stone out of the sky. It was more drifting closer to horizontal. So that's typically what I want when I'm targeting a fish. So how do we achieve that? Let's talk a little bit about that. Okay, so let's go through this process. First off, we have to assume here that the fish are on or near the bottom for this scenario to play out. There are instances where fish are suspended. So no matter what, it usually pays to fish shallow to deep. So that if you have water where it's deep enough that the fish can suspend, you can work your way down and catch some of those more aggressive fish that are either suspended or at least willing to come up through the column. That's not always the case though. So if you really do need to get near the deck, this is how I go about doing it. The first step is you have to pick your target lie. You're going to set up your position in the river based on that target lie. Most people, if they're Euro-nymphing, they're going to put that target lie more or less about perpendicular straight across from them. And sometimes if you're worried about spooking fish, you might put it quartering upstream of you or something like that. Or if it's a really deep run and you need to get it on the swing especially, then you might put it down below you. But in general, you're going to pick a lie, and you're going to adjust your own position based on that lie. Next, you're going to estimate how much weight and drift length you need before you approach that lie to get your flies down to the fish. You're going to make your cast upstream, you're going to start your drift, and you're going to let that sighter, approach whatever leading angle or vertical angle that you want out of it. And that fly needs to reach that fish without touching the bottom. Lots of times people think that their flies have to be hard on the deck right away, and so they end up ticking. Well, in that instance, you're having the same scenario that my friend Kurt had. The fly is dropping vertically out of the sky, and it's hitting the bottom before it ever gets to the fish. So I like to play with the distance above that target lie to begin with. I might start short, and that in a pocket water scenario, you might only put your fly 6 inches in front of the target lie that you think the fish is going to be in. In a big deep run, you might make a cast that's 15 or 20 feet above that spot. But you have to learn through experience how much leading length or how long your cast has to be to get enough sink time to get down to the spot where you're at. And it's going to depend on depth and velocity and just the characteristics of the flow around you and how far you actually can make your cast above it and still get it to the fish. All right, so now that you've got those first couple steps out of the way, you're making your drift, you've got a certain amount of weight on your rig, and you're going to look for tension in your leader in the first part of your drift. You make your cast, it's drifting along, and you're looking at that sighter. And normally I like to stall my rod, wait for that sighter and the leader to catch up a little bit so it's a little closer to vertical, and I'm looking at the sighter for tension in it. If you have any sort of sag or bowing, arcing in the leader, then especially with the micro leader, then you aren't getting tension. That's giving you strike detection for one, but your fly is also staying in the upper part of the column. What I look for, I call my friend Paul Kirby, he calls the downshift. And it's a great name for what basically happens. So if the current's going this way, you make your cast and your fly is going this downstream. If your sighter never gets tension and it stays kind of curved like this through the whole drift and you never tick bottom, you know that your flies stayed in the upper half or the upper 2/3 of the column of the river. But if it's drifting along and all of a sudden your sighter just gets a little bit of tension, just tightens up a little bit, what's happening, if it's not a take, obviously, is your flies are sinking down near the bottom in that boundary layer. And the boundary layer is the area of the river that's down near the bottom that's in high friction or high association with the substrate where it's being slowed down a lot. So if your fly or flies gets into that boundary layer, they want to drift slower, but you're going faster than that speed. So naturally they pull back on your leader a little bit and you get a little bit of tension. So they downshift in speed. And that's what I'm looking for before I ever worry about the fly ticking or not. So the fourth step in the process, or the last step here, is once you've looked for that downshift, then you're going to try and see if you tick bottom at all. If your fly stops and you set the hook and it's not a fish, you've probably ticked bottom. I think a lot of people try and tick bottom too much. If you look at the anatomy of a trout, they are built to be drift feeders most of the time. Unless they're in a slow, weedy part of the water, they're not tilting their head down and grubbing in grass and pulling stuff out. Most of the time, they're sitting in the current, waiting for stuff to drift past them, and then they're raising, lowering, darting to the side to grab it. If your flies are under the fish, they will not see them. So, if you're ticking bottom all the time, at least your point fly is under the fish, and you're going to lose it from snags a lot more often, but also it's going to look unnatural as it stops and stops and stops. And sometimes that can be a presentation that works, but more often than not, I want my flies in the drift at least to begin with. So when should you tick bottom and how often? Normally, I never want to tick bottom before I reach my target lie. The only caveat to that would be if you made a cast up onto a really shallow shelf and it drops into a big deep run. Sometimes if you're a little bit inaccurate and you go a little too high on the shelf, you might tick bottom right away. But in general, you're going to try and hit the lip of that shelf, get your flies down, and they're not going to tick bottom before you reach your target lie that you've already established. If you're ticking bottom before that target lie, you are getting too deep. And we're going to do another separate video on how to adjust for depth, but you know you're too deep if you're ticking bottom before you get to your target lie. As far as how often you should tick bottom, normally I want maybe once every 3 to 5 casts. I don't want it every cast unless you're only hitting a really tiny little pocket of depth and it gets really shallow once you drift out of that spot. It's pretty impossible not to tick, obviously, if you drift out of that. But I want to drift without a tick to the fish, and then once I get below that target lie, it's okay for me to tick, but I really only have it hit the bottom every 3 to 5 casts. If it's more often than that, you probably have too much weight. On the flip side though, remember, if you're not downshifting, you're not getting that tension, and you're never ticking bottom, you're probably not getting deep enough for at least the fish that are in that boundary layer and you're missing out. So just remember, let the fish be your guide. If you're catching fish, you're at least doing something right. You might be able to catch more with an adjustment to your sink rate, but let the fish be your guide. Beyond that, look for that 4-step process. So in summary, how do you know when you're fishing deep enough? Number 1, pick your target lie. Find that place in the river you think there's going to be a fish. Number 2, start making casts closer to your target lie to begin with, so you work shallower, and then progressively further up until you work deeper. Number 3, watch for that downshift. Look at that sighter and try and get a little bit of tension before you get to your target lie. And number 4, look for ticking the bottom. Remember, don't tick bottom in front of your target lie, and only tick bottom every few casts, typically below that target lie. If you're doing that, you're probably going to be in the right depth zone, and at that point, you need to worry about other aspects of your presentation, like your drift speed or your fly choice, etc., to help you catch fish. So I hope these tips helped you out and help you understand a little bit more how to go about figuring out whether you're at the right depth. If you liked it, please give us that thumbs up on the video. Go ahead and subscribe to the Tactical Fly Fisher channel, share it with your friends, and then come on over to tacticalflyfisher.com. We'll help you out with whatever fly tying and fly fishing gear you need. Thanks for watching.